Today, I am delighted to welcome author, activist, all around badass, Judy Gumbo. Her book out now, let me show you, is Yippie Girl, about her history of activism, um, protesting and defeating the FBI, defeating. and So thank you so much, Judy, for joining us. And before we started, I remember saying I love this book and I love what you wrote here. I was honestly surprised, perhaps should not have been, that people weren't beating down your doors for your story. Do you mind walking us through the process of getting this published, some of the pushback, and also explaining the title? Because the Yippie movement, I think, is something that's is such a cool part of our history of activism. So,
okay, great. Well, I'll start by saying getting this book published was a slog. I went through a number of people seeing if I could find an agent, one of whom a guy said to me, well, I really can't do it because my girlfriend left me for the 60s. I said, okay, all right, fine. And then I went, I have a pretty large network of friends from back in the day, and I contacted a bunch of them, and they had certain suggestions. And I had what I thought was a pretty decent proposal, but nobody picked up on it. There was one woman who picked up on it and it basically wasted my time for a couple of years. And so I ended up not using her or having to essentially back away from her. And then I sort of was moping around, not knowing what to do. And a friend of mine named Pat Thomas, who wrote a coffee table book on Jerry Rubin, hooked me up with Three Rooms Press. And they are Dadaists. So they loved the Yippie Girl part of it. And they were the ones who came up with the second part of the title. I had something like love, life, and the joy of protest, but they came up with the exploits and protest and defeating the FBI. And I think that the love portion, which is the relationship portion, which is all the women who write to me tell me how much they like that part. So I think that's played down a little bit, but people really do like the book. They really, really do. And so that. I think that the whole process of writing the book and let me just say the whole process of selling the book to a publisher took about 3 years, and it was full of disappointment until Three Rooms came along, thanks to Pat. So here I am, and it's published.
Well, it is so great to kind of read this. And again, so the Yippie movement, which goes back, and you're one of the founders of this.
Oh, yes, that's
obviously not like Yippies. So explain how you are quite different from the Wall Street folks of the 80s, of the Yippies. You're quite a different movement.
Well, we certainly were. We were a group of, it was a male-dominated group that had a very large number of women in it. The people who of my generation who recognize the names are Jerry Rubin and Nancy Kershan, who was his partner at the time, Anita and Abby Hoffman, Paul Krasner, Phil Oakes, and and of course myself and my late husband Stu Albert. So, and we were kind of the central core. And what the Yippies believed in and acted on was satire. Remember, we were in the middle and at the end of a horrific war, and what we had to do was figure out a way to sort of distance ourselves from the quote unquote serious social protesters who were doing a great job, but they didn't fit our particular style of theater, which was a theatrical movement. And so what the Yippies did that I would say we are most famous for is, one, we brought the stock exchange to a halt by throwing money from the balcony. We've got, I think it was a total of $200. Of course, that was always controversial. Was it 200? Was 300? Was 500? But we got what I recall as $200 and $1 bills. And we marched up, led by Abby. We marched up to the stock exchange, and at that point, the guard said, "I can't let you in." And Abby said, "The reason you won't let us in is because we're Jewish." So he did, right? The guard. And we threw the money, and the stockbrokers stopped trading and grabbed at the dollar bills falling down. But then once we ran out of dollar bills, we started to throw change, at which point the stockbrokers booed. They didn't want the change. They only wanted the dollars.
That seems sort of in line. And so from this satire,
Right.
what possibly made, someone like yourself a threat to the US government? So you're expressing your First Amendment rights, you're out there, and yet the FBI, and please tell folks about this. You were under surveillance. So you weren't stealing nuclear secrets and hiding it in your Florida McMansion basement.
Oh, yeah, right.
And you weren't, literally proposing to overthrow the government violently through, in different ways, but not like, not seceding.
Satire and comedy, yes.
But I love that you go like, maybe we were going to overthrow that. Maybe there was cause.
It depends a lot on how you define that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, how did I get to be what was called a prime suspect? I happened to be in Washington, D.C., I guess this would be 1971, when the Weather Underground put a bomb in the Capitol building, and no one was killed, no one was injured. They had a warning. They sent a warning to all agencies beforehand, but they did damage a bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as it happened, I was in the Capitol at that time organizing something called May Day, which was our slogan was, "If the government won't stop the war, we'll stop the government." And our plan was to go into the streets of DC and sit down and block traffic. But I have to say that after I heard about the Weather Underground, who were the bombers blowing up this bathroom in the Capitol, I and Stu, not late at that point, but my late husband and two others went out on the porch of where we were staying in DC as organizers of May Day. We went out on the porch, and across the street was a fire station with a camera pointed directly at us. So I knew that we were being surveilled. So we went out on the porch and we did a can because we felt, and I still do feel, that at that particular moment in time, the United States was a Goliath, and we were Davids.
Oh yeah,
by protesting. But that put me front and center in the surveillance apparatus of the FBI.
Absolutely, and I guess this is an important point to make, because obviously you were, in your own way, a threat to the existing system. And so if we look back, I think there's often trouble for folks to accept that, like, well, now, of course, Martin Luther King's wonderful. Conservatives are very, suddenly they love this guy. It's like, well, no, he was considered very dangerous, and suffragists going out and saying, hey, maybe women should vote, was obviously throwing up against the social order. Right. And so that's always in its way sort of overthrowing the government or pushing the government to change. It just becomes sort of making the moral distinction between, well, your violent movement is to keep people in slavery, like the Civil War. So that's less kind of something we're going to be like, yay, or trying to keep Donald Trump in office as an unelected dictator is not something that we're going to be like, wow, that's wonderful. So, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks believe that what you guys were doing in the 60s just was sort of, everyone was like, oh yes, these kids are making a good point and let's not give them hell. But they were, the government was giving you hell and was not appreciating your efforts.
That's absolutely right. And actually, there was a letter, an article in the Times this morning about the FBI and Trump and what they did to Trump. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, oh my God, They burglarized my house 7 times. They installed 2 tracking devices on my car, and I actually volunteered in an earlier letter to the Times. Maybe I should meet with Trump. That would be weird.
Give him some
Yeah,
clue, some tips as to how to get over what he calls this horrible persecution.
right,
It's a very interesting, right? Like the idea of if they'll do this to the president, what will they do to you? As
exactly.
in, well, okay, maybe we would be held. They're already doing it to us.
And they already did. At a certain point, I was subpoenaed to a grand jury, as were 400 other people in the United States, because the FBI and the Justice Department could not find the people who actually did the action in the Capitol. So they just subpoenaed everybody they could possibly put their hands on. Uh,
um, and neutralizing leaders who might have been a potential threat. So the Fred Hampton's,
yes, exactly.
his assassination, FBI has been linked toward, linked to say generously, only been linked to, and the surveillance of Martin Luther King and other groups of anyone seen as a potential threat of organizing. Organizing has always been sort of the most dangerous
Exactly.
thing that's going on. And I guess that brings us to, the activism now. Like activism obviously continues. It's not something that just sort of occurred in the 60s, happened in the 70s. And recently, the racial justice protests and unrest in there. I've read interviews from you and you're like, it was something you wish you could have participated in, obviously, given the potential risk to yourself to violence or whatever on the streets there. That was not necessarily something that you could do in 2020, if I understood. But what was your take on what was going on in 2020 as far as like the movement to sort of challenge the police and some of the police violence?
Well, the police violence was completely expected.
Mm.
What else is new? I mean, this is what happens. We have an issue here in Berkeley with People's Park, and the university did exactly what they did back in 1969. They fenced in the park, they put cops inside, and there's a difference now in the outcome. At least there's a postponement, but it was exactly the same scenario. Bureaucrats act bureaucratically and do what they think they must. But in terms of activism today, first of all, this is not an excuse, it's more of an excuse that I just celebrated my 79th birthday. And
Ray,
yeah, but
congratulations.
I have a lot more fear about going out in the streets and being potentially attacked by cops at this age than I used to. I used to love it, and I still I do it. It was like being in the streets is very fulfilling because you are taking your ideals and putting them into action. And
Mm.
that, for a dissident, for a radical, is absolutely the right thing to do and absolutely the right way to go. And I was very lucky that in my life I was able to act a lot for all the various causes that I believed in. And one of the things that's most interesting is that I didn't I wasn't I felt no I got off on it. I got off on running in the streets, and it's one of the things that I regret not feeling comfortable doing at age 79. I
Oh,
would love to do that. Just let me say for the record, I would
yeah.
love to do that, and but you know, it's
Well,
different.
they were. I mean, there's an argument that it was sort of a silencing or chilling effect. The police would come out and like it was like you were going to put yourself at risk.
That's right.
Generally speaking, whatever you were going to do, at some point, something would get instigated, often by the police, and that would become a source of potential violence. And
But
uh,
most often we didn't want to instigate the police.
yes,
We wanted to express ourselves freely.
yes.
In other words, free speech. And
Exactly what it is. And yet, and again, recently it seemed like they did reports and police were instigating a lot of this violence. And places like in Florida, where Ron DeSantis, the governor, was passing laws essentially encouraging violence against protesters.
Right.
And so it was, essentially to make it where people who want to come out and organize, because it's free association. You're getting together with other people, as you described, and getting in the streets. And they were trying to make that as difficult as possible, it seems, like through the implicit threat of violence. I know in Seattle, when I lived in Seattle briefly, I knew someone who wound up in jail overnight and was injured literally just because she kind of got in the way of a cop hurting another friend of hers, and she wound up in prison overnight. And so these are sort of things that you were sort of putting yourself in the line of fire on. And this comes to a question for you, because it seems like there's often, I've seen sometimes, a perhaps sort of cynical view that activism is only sort of, it's not connected to, everyone says, go vote, that here's the right way of making change, as if you aren't, as activists aren't actually involved in getting people to the polls, getting people, like, because, in my own history, it seems like there's a huge part of that. It's not that you're just kind of like, I want to show off and I don't care about making change. It's not true.
I think the show off is actually minimal, at least the activists I know. But what I do think is important is that there's a distinction between taking action, marching in the streets, protesting, and voting. And the distinction is that it's easier to vote than it is to march in the streets. I think both are necessary.
Absolutely.
I think you can't, if you just have voting, then you don't have a mass message that people understand that there's something really wrong and it can be changed. So you need to be able to do both, really, to organize to do both, to have people in the streets and to have people who aren't willing to go that far at this point in their lives for whatever reasons. They're only willing to vote. Good. Let them get out and vote, and let them organize others to vote, because that is what the Republicans have been doing, without the being in the streets part, but they have been organizing since our time, since my time. And this is why there are so many right-wing assholes around. I mean, it's really disgusting. I read a lot of what's going on in the right, and it's just, it's horrific.
Yeah, there is this sort of narrative, and it's not true if you go back, of like Republicans and like a right-wing movement. It's just all been very polite, and they just go out and they vote, and there's no anger and no discontent against the government. It's like it's insidious. And I was reading an article about Ginny Thomas, so Clarence Thomas's wife, and they, her mom had been big in the Phyllis Schlafly and that movement, and like in the 70s, like that movement really much was like, you were hearing a lot of the rhetoric you hear now. So it's like Ford was too weak, and this sort of, the Republicans of the Ford type Republicans have allowed the liberals to make any sort of progress at all, and we need someone like Reagan to come in and smack it down and gain more strength. And was clearly, and these are folks, they were organized. I mean, maybe they were suburban white ladies doing, having tea fergles, but it was organized and it was intense. And that was sort of what was moving things along, not just turning out and voting, but as you said, it was both of those things.
Let me just say one thing, which is that what you said at the beginning about it being sort of polite and everybody was sort of going along with everybody else. I'm a Canadian, and that's very Canadian. It really is. And that's one of the things that I was so happy to give up and break out of and work through once I emigrated to the United States. So just as an FYI.
Oh yeah, when was that, may I ask, that you left Canada?
1960, late 1967.
Oh, okay.
And luckily enough, I moved to Berkeley, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and so you're in Berkeley now. You've lived in Berkeley for a while, and I'll get into your period of being in Portland as a Portlander now. But a lot of what we're seeing, like in the Bay Area, a lot of it's interesting to me because in the Bay Area right now, there's a lot of pushback apparently about, oh, we need more cops to come in and deal with, say, crime or the homeless. And I was in New York recently and saw the same thing. It just seems to me it's a very clear pattern of there's often, if you look at what happens in these cities, such as San Francisco, there's a tremendous amount of income inequality, like a lot of wealth.
Right.
People can't afford to live in those cities anymore. And then there's increased, unhoused population or people on the streets. And it seems like there's this aesthetic reaction to it of like, I don't want to look at this while I go to my nice, Russian Hill apartment, and I want the cops to come and deal with it, rather than like, well, can we just find a way to house these people? How much of this have you witnessed while living there, the change in the Bay Area, and sort of the kind of the income, kind of the craziness, happening?
Remember though, I lived here in the 60s, then moved and ended up in Portland for 20 years. And then after Stu, late husband, died, I moved back here because that's where my daughter lives. I think that what you say about unhoused is certainly true. It exists. It's and the population of unhoused people is rising. But the question is, what is the role of the cops? Right? Isn't that the question? What's the role of the cops? And I have to tell you, there have been 2 shootings within 2 blocks of me recently. I don't go out at night anymore, except directly to the car. Luckily, I live in a co-housing community, so we have a parking lot. We can't be in denial about the rise in the crime rate.
Mm-hmm.
Can't.
Absolutely.
And can the cops do anything about it? I don't know. But I do know that a lot of people are complaining, well, where are the cops? Because what Berkeley, I believe, wants to do is set up various interventions by, say, psychiatrists or psychologists or whatever. I don't have a really good answer for this. I mean, back in my day, the cops were trained in Alabama, so that's why they felt free to shoot anybody, and especially people of color. I don't believe that's true anymore, but it's very hard to come up with something that will alleviate, say, the shootings literally 2 blocks from my house, and also satisfy and and also meet the needs of unhoused people. If I had a good answer, I'd run for Berkeley City Council, but I don't.
Or if you work there are a lot of people who do run for office without good answers. So it's you have a humility that a lot of Republicans do not.
That's because I'm not a Republican.
You're like,
it's interesting that you talk about humility. I had a good friend, and I'm now actually friends with his granddaughter, in Vietnam. And he was, as you know from my book, my lover. And the phrase that he came up with, which I think is very applicable to activists today, and the conflicts, in the inner conflicts of activist movements. And he said, "Be good to friends who are good to you, and also be good to friends who are bad to you, for only friends will go with you on the long road to revolution."
Oh, wow.
And that, to me, is kind of the way to go. Now, are cops friends? I don't think so. But if they're coming across as friends, they better fucking act like them and not, do the terrible things that they do.
Well, it's like a sense of, can the police resolve what is ultimately an economic issue? Even crime itself, they've already, right. And it tends to be, I can imagine, it's a good faith debate between everyone. Like, is rising crime related to lack of opportunity or economic issues, or is it just you need to, as noted law follower Julie Giuliani said, just do broken windows and stop and frisk, and essentially have people live in a police state,
right?
Which the answer for that is obviously not true. Something I've written about a lot, because you've seen how people on the right, white folks on the right, respond where anyone gets some of that treatment. Like, oh my God, the police came to my house and searched it, and oh, I broke into the Capitol and now I got arrested. Well, yeah.
Exactly.
It's like, well, so as I've always said, like, if you want to have peace through a police state, it can't just be me living there. If
Right.
you want to be in there, fine, but it's not what I've seen. I mean, I often joke in Portland. I was out and a neighbor, a friend of came out. She's like drinking a glass of wine. She offers me the wine. I was like, well, no, I can quote every law that I would be breaking. And it's just like, she just lives in a world, which I think we all should live in, where you're not being constantly policed. There's no, like if you live in certain neighborhoods where predominantly Black neighborhoods, if you were to do that, cops are going to be there in 5 seconds.
Right.
And that leads to all sorts of stuff. So here it's just like, well, no one wants to kind of live. No one really wants to live that way. No one wants to see people being beaten or and mistreated this way. Going back to your time in Portland, so while you were there, as I understand, you were working at Planned Parenthood.
That's correct.
You were a kind of
I was a
fundraiser.
Vice President of Development, which basically means fundraising, and I raised millions of dollars for my affiliate, which was a very gratifying thing to do. One of the people who was on our board was a Van Buren of the Van Buren president family.
Wow.
And I remember meeting with him and talking with him because we were setting up a new affiliate in the state of Washington, just across the border from Portland. And I suggested that he name the affiliate after his mother, who was also a American elite person. And he hadn't thought of that, but he was so happy that I had raised that as a possibility that he absolutely went ahead. He made a huge donation to the new clinic. I don't remember how much it was, but every time I saw him after that, he would say, thank you for letting me name the clinic after my mother. Now, this is the point is that he and his mother were in the elite and had a shitload of money. Mm-hmm. But the people who use that clinic are not, right? The Planned Parenthood serves low to no income people as the majority of the people that they serve. So I knew, and there was no facility in the state of Washington to make it easier for women. So I knew that, that we can't, I don't think, maybe it's just age, but I don't think we can overthrow the entire American system so easily. Yeah. I used to, perhaps, but I don't think we can now. So the question is, what steps can we take? And whether it's providing abortion services to low-income women who want them, or providing a wealthy member of the United States elite a way to feel good about what they're doing, and also helping people at the same time. I'm definitely right now in a more, and again, it must be age, but it's you do what you can when you can.
Well, absolutely.
But you do everything you can when you can.
Well, because we don't necessarily live in a socialist society right now. People have tons of money, and better to get that and have them fund a clinic than buy, an extra
Tesla
home somewhere. Yes, or a Tesla. Yeah, and it's. And what are your thoughts? I mean, as someone who's been doing that work, has done that work for so long, like where we are, how much of a shock, or wasn't a shock when the Supreme Court overturned Roe and kind of the laws are suddenly being passed at the state level now? What are your thoughts on this?
I have a picture which I can send you after this if you like.
Oh, great, thank you.
I was disgusted. I was happy. I'm sorry. Take that one out. I was not. I was so unhappy that I just have this, I'm going to fight back, terrible expression on my face. And it was a terrible thing. And the manipulation of the process that allowed all these right-wingers, especially the last couple on the Supreme Court, was outrageous. It was outrageous. And so I felt angry, powerless, and determined to do, again, whatever I could to stop that from happening. But I feel it in part like a lot of what I worked for in those 50, 60, 70 years is, where is it now? Where are the
Mm.
people now who support abortion care? And I'm just hoping and um, uh, hoping and hoping and hoping that at the next election, in the fall, that enough people will be out in the streets protesting and voting to at least allow Biden to,
Mm.
do something to make the court less piggy than
Yeah,
it.
there's been some encouraging polls showing, particularly among women and even dads. I think dads have shifted as a demographic
Right,
towards Democrats in recent polling. And you want to hope, because ultimately, I mean, we've always said, oh, well, the majority of Americans have supported abortion rights. But often what happens is, well, Republicans know that, but then they're going to say, oh, well, do you support it as much as this tax cut or as much as more police?
right,
And certain people, including women, a good number of women who vote Republican, have made that decision. And I think hopefully, to your point, this fall will be the case of we are prioritizing this issue, this right that was taken from us, and there will be because I don't know, it felt like I obviously was not there, but I would feel like if I'm protesting for civil rights, it seems as if I am a Goliath, I mean, a David against this Goliath. Most of the people are opposed to me, and I'm trying to fight this. And it does feel, in a weird way, you do feel more powerless when it seems like, well, most of the people support,
right.
everything from abortion rights to voting rights to health. Here's this whole laundry list that most people support. The world would be much better, but a minority has manipulated the system to the point where it's almost like our system of government feels a lot like South Africa during
Mhm.
apartheid. Like the system's been manipulated to that point. I think that's a great word that you use, to manipulate it, because through the Senate, through even Trump had lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, so it just felt like there's not, oh, it doesn't matter and we have to break through that. It's like, well, it does matter, we just have to like make it matter, vote, and then figure out how to fix these systems that they've been manipulating against us.
Right. Well, one of the things that the Republicans succeeded at, and that we also succeeded at in the 60s, but with a very different politics, is organizing small groups to make change.
Mhm.
And it's that personal one on one relationship. Like my friend said, good to friends who are good to you, uh, good to friends who are bad to you. It's that long term personal relationship that you develop doing organizing. And it doesn't matter if you're sitting around in a consciousness raising group or out on the streets with a sign. You still, the more you can connect with like-minded people, the stronger your movement is going to be.
Yeah.
Period. And
And that's great. And that's something that you seem to able to do so very well. You've done it in this book, and you seem to be, I mean, as someone who's had experience development, it's a tough job. If you can get money from rich people who are some of the cheapest SOBs in the world, despite their wealth, you could probably convince someone who might have been voting Republican in the past to be like, no, here's what we need to do, and here's a better way. And there's so much that someone like yourself can kind of do with that, of like, come on, like we can't keep doing what we're doing.
when I worked at Planned Parenthood, when your friend David Greenberg was my boss, there were a number of uh, like I said, there were a number of wealthy people, and but there were also a number of people who were like, I had this one guy who was I don't remember what he did, but it was a low end job. He lived close to the freeway. He drove a truck, but his mother had started to invest in the stock market when back in the 1920s, and so I I would go and talk to him about his mother, about his living situation, and what was going on at Planned Parenthood. And when he died, he left us a very substantial bequest.
Oh
Now,
wow.
so what I'm saying is that it's really so often is the commitment, the personal commitment to the cause, that will motivate people to act. And that's why it's important not to be condescending.
Absolutely.
It's just again my however so many decades of experience with this, it really is, and I know that a lot of the people who like my book are people who knew me or knew of me back in the day.
Yeah, and something you touched on the book that I think is also great for folks to know. Obviously, as a feminist or a woman facing a lot of sort of inherent kind of chauvinism, even obviously amongst the left, I think that still exists amongst the left.
Yeah.
And you were sort of on the front lines of that. You in a newspaper in California, I think in Berkeley, you had started, and I think you had like a really misogynistic guy who had
Actually, that's why I
essentially.
wore this T-shirt. The Berkeley Barb is what you're talking about.
Yes, yeah, and can you really tell me that the guy? I think basically the women are revolting in a sort of grappling
Well,
mark.
that was, I was always of two minds about that. All right, so I had spoken at a Free Huey rally, and then I wrote up what I said for Max Shear at the Barb, and Max was a congenial person who paid 25 cents a column inch for people who wrote for the Barb, which meant that all the writers made their columns as long as they possibly could in order to make a little bit more money. And so I handed my piece in to Max, and he just sort of shoved it aside. And then when the paper came out, because he was the editor and the publisher, he titled my piece "Why the Women Are Revolting." And that, you could say, well, it's pretty fucking funny, but also pretty fucking demeaning. But I decided in the long run of history, which is a communist phrase, in the long run of history, I decided to use that as the title because, first of all, because it was funny, but second of all, it's because it was true. We were revolting, not in the revolting sense, but in the making a revolution sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that story, and I'm glad I did.
Oh yeah, I mean, and even your name. So obviously, I've ever asked of Judy Gumbo. The story of that is wonderful. Do you mind sharing with folks the story of your name, Gumbo, and how it came about?
I will share it as long as the folks that are listening consider buying a copy of Yippie Girl.
Yes, I will put it up again, and it is. This is it's not a total spoiler because I think some of it's out there, but yes, please, folks.
All right, so Eldridge Cleaver was a friend of mine, as was Kathleen Cleaver. Eldridge being the minister at the time, the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party. And he and my late husband, Stu, and I went to I guess it was a Panther meeting in the top floor of a physician who lived in whatever the heights in San Francisco, the name of the heights that's the most wealthy. And, and we were there in the meeting, and it was reasonably confrontational between Eldridge and and a Panther who was there. But then but eventually it cooled out and we left, and we got into Eldridge's car. Now Eldridge had a car phone, a very, very early car phone. And so it rang, and it was the guy that he'd had the confrontation with, and they made up over the phone. And Eldridge always used to call me Mrs. Stu. And that, the more I got involved in the women's movement, the more my feminist consciousness developed, the more pissed off I got at him calling me Mrs. Stu. And so he got off the call, he turns his head around, he says, "Mrs. Stu." And I said to him, and that took a lot of courage, "Eldridge, I am not Mrs. Stu. I am not Mrs. Anybody." And he, first I see the real Stu's shoulders go up and get nervous about this. But Eldridge, he continued to drive. And after a while, he said, "All right, then, I'll call you Gumbo." And the reason is that Eldridge was born in Arkansas, and to him, Gumbo was a stew. So that's a short, and ever since then, I've used the the Gumbo name, especially when I wanted to create a new identity for myself. I didn't, for example, use it at Planned Parenthood because it was felt like very different worlds. But I
Mm.
would tell people about my past and they would be interested. But for this, for Yippie Girl, and for this revisiting and re-understanding and recapitulating my past that I'm doing now, I am Judy Gumbo, and I'm glad to be Judy Gumbo. And this is what I want actually people to call me for however long I remain on the planet.
Well, that's awesome, and a lot. There's so much in this book about not only this period, but just again, being a young woman in this movement, navigating it, making sort of choices about becoming a mother, and you're an awesome mother. I can attest to that. I'm friends with your incredible daughter, and sort of the good work that goes on through her and through others. And so this really is something I feel like there's beyond the great stories and anecdotes here. It's a great story about your life. And right as I've mentioned, when we were setting up this interview, just feels so relevant right now.
Yeah.
We have activism, we have like what's the place, and a lot of the activism being woman driven, I feel,
Right.
more so than anything else. Like
Right.
our great actor, either there's Cori Bush and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez on the left, and then there's the women's movement, and then there's other groups, and it is seemingly very activism of like being out there is very much women driven. It's been great to see. Do you we kind of, as we say, would hope that a lot of the right wing, the men are not aware of the fact that, to go back to what you said, the women are the women are revolting. They are not putting up with what this kind of world that they want for
Right. Well, the pessimist part of me wonders how much the Republican men get off on their activism in the same way that we did. But I'm absolutely sure that women who participate in activism, even if they are just kind of going to because their friends are going, it's a life-changing kind of thing. I mean, when I worked at Planned Parenthood, I had a lot of women who were Planned Parenthood supporters who were Republicans. But that was the days before Rhino, before the name calling. And I have no idea now if those women still exist. It bothers me that there are that many women who are not uh, thinking about their children, their grandchildren, and the need to be able to choose for yourself how you want your life to be lived.
And that's a great question you also bring up, because there's been a lot of debate. I don't know the answer to that because I'm not inside voting booths, but there was an argument that starting with the Reagan era takeover of the religious right of the Republican Party, that slowly over time, pro-choice women became Democrats. If that was an issue between Democrats, what was left was sort of your Amy Coney Barrett's and so forth within the party. And others like, well, no, it's not all that. There's a silent majority. I mean, what is concerning, Liz Cheney, who recently lost her race in primary, she stood up to Trump. But at the same time, while she stood up for democracy, she is very much anti-abortion rights, to the point where she had even celebrated the Dobbs ruling in July. So it does raise the question of like, what is within the Republican Party? There is, will there be a true defection, or we're already seeing a defection? I hope there's more. I would have to think like that it's not just all, religious fundamentalists in that group anymore.
Sitting here in my lovely Berkeley co-housing house, I can read about it in the paper, but I don't know any women like that anymore. I just don't, and it's distressing to read and to see the Republican rallies where there are a bunch of white women, because the men are there and they're white. So there's basically a bunch of white women, white men who are cheering on Trump because I guess because it gives them a sense of identity, but I don't know. And the problem with not knowing is then you don't know how strategically to resist it. And so what I'm thinking more and more is that our original strategy of small groups, raising awareness, raising consciousness, getting to know each other, trying to tap into what is it in every woman's sensibility that they are most attuned to, then if we could figure that out and bring that up to the fore, because if you don't have the heart, if you don't have the commitment and the passion for whatever cause it is, then you're not going to want to do anything. Mm-hmm. Getting into that passion, feeling that passion, experiencing that passion, whatever it is, whether it's fighting against abuse or rape or fighting for the environment or fighting for abortion rights, you have to figure out what is it that most moves you as an individual being. And once you get there, then you never know where it's going to lead. You just don't know. And hopefully it leads in a direction that will bring this country back to where we were, 10 years ago, 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the lessons is that there was that going on in the right wing. They weren't necessarily ceding any of the progress we made. They weren't accepting that. They were like, planning and plotting. Samuel Alito especially is just sort of relishing in his newfound power, and he is like one of the most powerful. He's more powerful than anyone right now, and that's obviously dangerous. You'd earlier talked about the sense of feeling, the powerlessness, and it's strange to me when I will read stuff from Trump's, Republicans across the board. There is that theme of a feeling of powerlessness themselves that they have. If you watch a video of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it's disturbing because, from my sense, it's just like, oh, you feel powerless just because trans people exist or that people are like, I don't know how to. I don't want anyone to feel powerless, but if you really are just that people are different than you and are treated equally, physically hurts you. I don't know how do we resolve that? How do we? Because you want to be able to sit down with them and try to like communicate and break through that. Like, why? And it does seem, with certain people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's just like there's no getting through that. There's a sense of just they.
No, forget that. But it does go back to my friend Wang from Vietnam, right? Be good to friends who are good to you. Also be good to friends who are bad to you, because only friends will go with you on the long road to revolution. And we need to get back on that long road to revolution, and which is why we have to accept that people will only at least start out by only going as far as they think they can, or don't feel threatened, or don't feel afraid. So and you're talking to an extremist. I am an extremist. I'm happily an extremist. I've always been an extremist. And so for me to say shit like this is pretty amazing, because normally I would say, rah, rah, take him to the streets, out, get the barricades. You know what I mean? I've never been one to really advocate for being nice to people with whom I disagree. Times have changed.
Yeah, well, it's and there's also so many folks out there who we can activate, who feel like, as I've said, I've often written that, trying to flip certain people who've been kind of who watch Tucker Carlson every night and brainwashed, like a lot of that energy take and go to, a Black barbershop in my neighborhood and find someone who feels like, well, I don't know if my vote matters, or that the system is all about the same and nothing changes, and try to get them to be convinced that the world, like to break through that sort of defeatism that is part of the system.
Right.
and activate that. I think that's sort of a core, kind of a catalyst in every history. It's been that, and I'm sure in your history, but I mean, reading autobiography from Malcolm X the same way, of someone just feeling broken and
Right.
comes in. It's like, there is a way you can do more.
Right.
You're not just a cog in this.
You know, last year, I think it was the 50th anniversary. I think it was 50th or 45th. I don't even remember, of the Black Panther Party.
Mm-hmm.
And what's amazing is how much the Panthers, who were very prominent here back in my day, and then through various internecine conflicts and killings, and just the party completely collapsed. But it's back. There is a Panther Women's Museum. There are signs up. There are murals all over Oakland of Black people who are clearly, obviously, revolutionaries back from my day, or also in the present. There is a sign, a commemorative sign for Huey Newton somewhere, and so at this anniversary, what the Panthers did, they basically took people on tours and say, this happened here, and now we have this. This happened here, and now we have this sign. This happened here, but Elaine Brown is making a giant new housing development for low-income Black people. So it's like the myth may not be completely accurate, but the myth of the Panthers does not die.
That's great.
And it's important. That's one reason that I wrote Yippie Girl, was I wanted to make sure that people your age, people my daughter's age, and even my grandson got to know what we did and why we did it, and to be hopefully inspired to do that in their own lives. And one of the things that I found that's really interesting is that people in their 40s who are the children of West Coast or any radical movement, they're all of a sudden out there doing things that are important to get the 60s message across. Like Zaid Dorn, who is the Weather Underground, Bernadine Dorn and Billy Ayers' son, has just done an award-winning podcast. So, you know, and my daughter was very, very helpful with Yippie Girl. So there's lots of motion. And I have a friend in Vietnam who is pretty high up in the government, and and he wants to organize an event for the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. And I said to him, well, you know, you should contact the children, because a lot of us older people are not going to take a 8-hour to 10-hour plane ride to get to Vietnam to help celebrate. But I said, you should contact the children. And he called me back last night. He said, that is a terrific idea. He's going to move it up his levels and try to make it happen. So it's not necessarily up to us, my generation now, but it's up to yours, and it's up to my daughters, and it's up to Zaid's. I mean, there are many, many people. The 60s social protest movement was massive. And the women's movement was massive, and the Black Power movement was massive. There are a lot, but the people who actually participated now are pretty old. But a lot of us have kids, and it really is up to the kids now to do what they feel, and they know to do what they feel is important, and they also know much better than people my age do what the lay of the land is. So I strongly encourage anyone who's listening or talking, or who, if you're my age, talk to your daughters and sons. If not, find those people who are children of the 60s, children of 60s adults, and just they're the ones to reach out to make change, in my opinion.
And I read an interview where you said it as much while promoting Yippie Girl, about it really is about getting the young people out, you know, and I wouldn't say seed the floors and, like, you know, that there's no more use for people of a certain age, but more of like, no, we want to activate the youth and get the youth out there,
right,
and let them learn from what, you know, take the best of what we've done and learn from the past
and apply it to their particular situation. And it's not through lack of wanting to do this on my generation. It's through lack of energy. You know, you do something and then it's like, And also, you know, I have to say, people are dying. We have, every few days I get so and so died, so and so died, so and so died, 88, 85, 79, 70. You know, our mortality is definitely showing. I mean, like, for example, in the Conspiracy 8 trial, which I write about in Yippie Girl, the only person left alive is one of the lesser defendants, whose name is temporarily escapes my mind, but everyone else is gone. You know, so we in my generation are very aware that our clock is ticking. So again, it's really up to you all and to even younger people. I'm just sort of not having no idea of your age, but I get your energy. So therefore, I'm
That's
assuming.
very kind of you. Yes, yeah, and my parents had grown up through this period also as well. My dad's a boomer, and my mom's a late boomer, and so yeah, it felt so recent because, you know, growing up, my parents are hearing what was happening, and it now you do look at and do the math, and it feels, yeah, it's been 50 years, whatever it happened. So this is just why it seems so.
Let me just ask: have your parents read the Yippie Girl?
I'm sitting here copying my dad. My mother's no longer with us, but my dad, I think, would love it. He's he loves reading about this sort of thing, and it's a lot of it would be a lot of fun for him. And this is just it was a period of so much change happens. My dad is someone who's a very quiet guy, and he will talk about some of these things that went on, and it does have that feel of like history. Oh my God, like this event or this, to be alive during those points. I mean, you get some of that now, where I'm at an age where there's people who are full grown adults who don't remember 9/11, right? Like, wait a minute, you know, like I have all these very vivid memories as a guy in my 20s when it happened, but now it's like someone who's, if they're 27 or 28, you know, 30, they're like, you know, they're at the age where people were shielding them from it, similar to other grand events. And so it can really catch up on you. And so it's so important that I feel like you've written this. I'll show this again, Yippie Girl. I love this photo, by the way.
Thank you.
The cover. It's just such a powerful kind of you and these ladies. And when was this taken? Do you mind?
This was taken in 1971 or 72. It was at the Republican, there was a Republican and Democratic convention in Miami Beach. The Republicans, I think, had to move because there was a big scandal with AT&T, so they moved their convention out of San Diego to Miami. So we had two conventions to protest the war at. That was great, and that's who's in the photograph. The woman on to my right, the shorter woman. Her name is, she's wearing a T-shirt that says "Live Like Her," and that's Madame Nguyen Thi Binh of Vietnam, who was one of our heroes. And Patty was at the time married to the artist Klaus Oldenburg, who was very famous. And the woman on my left is someone I have always believed was a police agent.
This lady right here?
Yeah, exactly. She's a little too straight and a little too, I don't know. She just,
I'm sorry, Judy, because this is such a beautiful photo. And I was like, oh, and you kind of just nailed the punchline of, and this lady's a narc. Oh my God.
Maybe. So I've met people who say yes, and I've met people who say no, and of course I have no idea where she is. So
now I do question everything.
Yeah,
I just really looking like, oh, the way she's holding the bag and the clap, like this is a cop. Like you've got me looking at this, but that was happening a lot, right? They were planning.
Oh, in Miami too, absolutely.
They would plant cops in to literally create the problem that then the cops would solve, right? Like so often, it's a kind of a classic tactic, and it's still being done even now.
Oh, and there was a whole thing with the plumbers, and there was it was all Nixonian and plumbers, and there was all kinds of stuff going on with cops in Miami. And I think I write about it some in Yippie Girl, but I don't go in depth. But there was all kinds of cop-based groups in Miami at that time. and so I wasn't surprised when I heard this about this woman, but like I say, I can't absolutely. I mean, I suppose it's gossip, so I shouldn't say it at all. But um,
It's just a hunch. You have
but,
no idea.
well,
It is not defamation to be part of a cop, even though you're on a Wonkette podcast.
okay, well, that's
um,
good to know.
so where can folks get this book? Where is it available?
It's available at any independent bookstore, and if it's not there, ask for it. It's available online directly from the publishers or at Amazon. If people are willing to do that. So it's Amazon, Goodreads, and Barnes and Noble online, and so it's quite readily available. And if people do buy it and do like it, I really could use people going to any book website, but especially those big three, and just rating it with 5 stars, because
Absolutely,
that's
please do.
what people do to get their books. You know, it's like I enjoy, totally. It was hard to write Yippie Girl, but I totally enjoyed it. This business of promotion is not a particularly enjoyable task to me, even though I had 2 of the world's greatest promoters, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, as mentors once when they were alive. So,
Well,
so if people I really appreciate people both buying the book and also rating it on any web publisher's website that allows for ratings.
well, for both, when this goes up on YouTube, there'll be links, and then I'll have links
Great.
in the Wonkette post that includes this. And I really enjoyed this. I recommend it. Yippie Girl by Judy Gumbo, and we'll figure out her story. That could be the sequel if there's. And thank you. I hope this part of the promotion was. I had a great time chatting with you, and I really, again, appreciate all that you've done in the movement, and taking the time to write it down and make sure that the story is there for future generations and so forth. So,
well, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate your commitment to changing the world that we live in and changing the country we live in to make it a much, much better place for everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Well, this has been Judy Gumbo. This has been, thank you for joining our sort of Wonkette book club. And please, again, information about Yippie Girl will be down below. Please check it out. I think you'll love it. And thank you again, Judy.
Sure. Well, thank you again. I really